Well, it depends on the context of what you're analyzing. So for instance, if you think that Manuela's score is above the mean, a one standard deviation above the mean, ito yung, if you think, for instance, that Manuela's score is above the mean, and then you say, but, okay, what is the most likely score of Manuela? Okay, then you'll say, maybe it's between 3 and 4.41. But you know, the probability, medyo maliit lang choices mo dito. So the probability of you capturing the actual score of Manuela is only within this extent. Medyo maliit. Okay, so if you want to be sure, you'll use 2 standard deviations above, and then you'll say, I'll be more confident that Manuela's score would be between 3 and 5 point something. Kasi nga, malaki yung choices mo. That's why you're more confident. Makukuha mo na dito yung actual score niya. Kung one standard deviation lang, mababa yung confidence mo kasi posible dito yung score niya. Diba? So to capture the actual score of Manuela, dagdagan mo ng one standard deviation. Okay? Then dagdagan mo pa ng one standard deviation if you really want to be very confident about your estimate. Okay. But of course, pag humahaba yan, yung accuracy bumababa. Yung precision bumababa. Tumataas yung confidence mo, pero bumababa yung precision mo. Okay, yun yung mga implications later. But in the typical way of using the standard deviation, we estimate one standard deviation above and one standard deviation below to estimate ano yung scores ng majority. Okay, 68% is still majority. So you'll say, yung score ng majority would be about 1.59 to 4.41. If Manuela is really a typical DLSU site major, her score would be within this majority. Okay, so standard deviation. Athena, okay na?
Yes, po, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, what else pa ba? I do appreciate if you ask questions.
Sabi ni Xavier, sir, can you
please graph the definitions again? Like this, isusulat ko. Kayo na, makinig kayo. Magsulat. Okay? Kasi ayokong spoon feed sa inyo. Okay? Kayo magko-complete niyan. Okay, I hope you understand. I don't want to spoon feed you so much. First time ko rin tinuro ito. Dahil spoon feed ko na sa inyo paano basahin to. Because a lot of students find it difficult to apply. So I'm showing you how you can possibly apply. This is how you're supposed to be thinking about statistical values. Okay. Sorry, Xavier, wag muna ha. Kayo muna. Form a study group. Okay. Okay. So let's go. Yes, Hannah.
Sir, so to clarify po, the sum of squares po is like the weight po of all of the observations po, sir. So like yung variance po, it's naka-single out to 1, which is the typical score po.
Well, I wouldn't use the word weight for the sum of squares kasi sum of squares is based on square deviation from the mean. And yung square deviation from the mean is better represented in the form of an area. So, lawak. Okay? So, lawak could actually give you amount. Okay? So, variation siya. So, sum of squares, okay, if you look at the table, if you look at the table here, notice the sum of square is is under total. So, it's the totality. Okay, so ito yung lawak, ito yung laki ng variation na observe mo sa sample na yan. Okay, total and then sample pa siya. Okay, so ito ang lawak, laki ng variation that you observe in this sample, total. Okay, notice the variance. Ang variance naman is typical, average, majority per person. So you'll say, bawat DLSU site major ay may amount of variability na 2 squared units per person. So, intindihin nyo itong table because this table was designed for you to really understand the how to interpret the values. Laruin ninyo ito. Kaka-align yan. Okay? And then, meron kang empirical, theoretical. Mamaya dagdagan natin to kasi empirical to. Okay? Hannah?
Thank you po, sir.
Okay. Any other questions before we continue? Yes, Athena?
Okay. Sir, ano po yung symbol for that sum of squares po?
SS. 2 capital S.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Now, let's continue ngayon. Okay? So, notice, okay, let's operate muna on deviation from the mean. These deviations from the mean, okay, from the actual deviations from the mean to the average deviation from the mean, also known as standard deviation, these are described to be empirical. Bakit siya empirical? Because these values were kind of linked to per person. Okay? As long as you're talking about per person, it becomes empirical. If you computed it based on this, it becomes empirical. And for this reason, this is also an empirical value describing what you observe in a DLSU student. So you're saying, okay, you observed an extent of variation from the mean of 1.41 per 1 DLSU site major. Okay, parang yung interpretation yan, it's like this. Okay, dito, kasi ito, mga scores yan. So you say, you observed a score of 3 per 1 DLSU site major. Ano ito? Extent deviation from the mean. So you say, you observed a deviation from the mean of 1.41 per 1 DLSU site major. 2. Ano itong 2? It's under square deviation from the mean. So you say, you observed a square deviation from the mean of 2 squared units per 1 DLSU site major. Ganun siya. Okay? So these are all empirical in nature. But just what we had before, if there is empirical, there must be a theoretically expected deviation from the mean. Dapat may ganyan. Okay? So if that is the case, then there is a theoretically expected extent of variation from the mean. The question is, ano yung value ng theoretically expected na yan? Okay, what do you think? Using the patterns in this table, okay, what do you think would be the value of the theoretically expected deviation from the mean? Look at the pattern here. Apply mo yung pattern dyan, dito. So what would be the value of the theoretically expected deviation from the mean? Athena, you're saying something?
Sir, I think we should, I guess ko lang po, pero I'm not sure po, pero minus po yung meaning of life sa score ng F. Mas small I.
Look at this scenario. Okay. The empirical score that we observe from DLSU site majors is 3. So in a way, we're saying every DLSU site major had a score of 3. So if we are to describe Mike as a DLSU site major, his theoretically expected score would be 3. Now, what about this? What does this mean? Standard deviation. It's average, di ba? And what does an average say? you're saying that every DLSU site major that you observe had a deviation from the mean of 1.41. So that means being a DLSU site major, the the deviation from the mean would be 1.41. If we are to describe Mike as a DLSU site major, his theoretically expected deviation from the mean would be equal to, Francis?
Sir, as Hannah pointed out po, it would theoretically be 0, sir.
0? No, ito pa rin, 1.41. Look at the pattern. Remember, we're using we're using an average as an empirical value when you describe a sample and a theoretical value when you describe a person who belongs in that sample. So, if the standard deviation is the average deviation from the mean in this sample, then we can use this average deviation from the mean to estimate the expected deviation from the mean of this person as a DLSU site major. Look at the pattern. Pare-pareho yung pattern dyan. Okay, so for that reason, tada! It's the standard deviation. Okay, so meaning, okay, again, sorry for being makulit. We're dealing with average values. There are different average values. You have the mean, which is the average score. The standard deviation is the average deviation from the mean. The variance is average squared deviation from the mean. So far, ito yung meron natin. Okay, meron pa yan. So, madadagdagan pa yan. As far as average values are concerned, you can use them or you can interpret them in two ways. If you're using the average value to describe a sample, it is empirical in nature. But if you use the average value to describe a person in that sample, it becomes a theoretically expected value. Okay, so let's look at the mean. Okay, we said the average score that we empirically observed in a sample of DLSU site majors is 3. So we're saying that every DLSU site major, we empirically observe a score of 3. Okay. Now, use the mean to describe Mike as a DLSU site major. So it becomes theoretically expected. So you say the theoretically expected score for Mike as a DLSU site major is equal to 3. So notice the mean is being interpreted in two ways depending on what you are describing. Are you describing a sample? Then it's empirical. Are you describing a person as a member of that sample? Then it becomes a theoretically expected value. So when it comes to the standard deviation, okay, our standard deviation is 1.41. Okay? So you say the average deviation from the mean that we empirically observe in a sample of DLSU site major is 1.41. Okay, therefore, the average, the deviation from the mean that we would observe from Mike as a DLSU site major is supposed to be equal to 1.41. Okay, two uses how we interpret averaged values. Yes, Suvi?
Just to clarify, when you say the expected standard deviation, you mean plus or minus, right?
Yes, technically it's plus or minus. Good question, but we usually write it as positive. Okay, the plus and minus is just a locator. If it's minus, that means we're referring to it as below the mean. If it's positive, we're referring to above the mean. But by default, we always represent the standard deviation as a positive value. Okay. You just have to adjust it at the back of your head in a while. Okay, so parang ganun. Thank you for that. question. Okay, so notice, okay, you have empirical and a theoretically expected value. So for this reason, the next step is consolidate these two values. How do we put together these two values? Okay, so you have an empirical actual value and a theoretically expected value. What about this? This becomes an empirical actual value that you observe from a person, and this is the expected value. So we need to find a way to consolidate these two. Okay? So notice in the initial analysis, we consolidated this empirical score and theoretically expected score by getting the difference. And the difference, okay, is always using this formula, empirical minus theoretical. The theory operates as the standard. So you're actually saying how different is the actual value of a person from the theoretically expected value. Okay? So, kumbaga, in our formula, that's x minus mean. Mean being the true score, the expected score. So, how different is the actual score of Mike, okay, from the expected score of 3? Okay? So, that captured the deviation from the mean. So, this formula captures how different is the empirical from the theoretical. So, ipa-plug in mo lang yung values later. Ano yung empirical dyan sa analysis mo? Ano yung theoretical sa analysis mo? Plug in lang the values. Okay? So, the empirical was the actual score of Mike. The theoretical would be the theoretically expected score of Mike, which is equal to the mean. So, you say, how different is the actual score of Mike from the theoretically expected score as a DLSU psych major? That's how you can interpret this. Okay. So it's really understanding the formula. Okay, what the formula is telling us. Di ba tinuro ito sa algebra? We know how to subtract, but do we know what they mean? Parang ganun, di ba? So, ayun. Iba pag T minus E, pag ginamit mo T minus E, how different is the theoretical from the empirical? Ang empirical, ang gold standard. Okay. Gaano kakaiba ang expectation mo dun sa actual? Okay. Iba na yung formula nun, T minus E. Pero ang tanong mo is, how different is the actual from the theoretical, T minus T? Tandaan nyo yan, ha? Okay, I'll be checking on this, whether you understand formulas. Okay, so example, A minus B. Ang bagal natin. You're asking how different A is from B, as if B is the gold standard. Pag B minus A, how different is B from A, as if A is the gold standard. So may political and sociological implication ng mga questions na yan later on. Okay? Example, male versus female. Okay? So in this case, M minus F, how different is a male person from a female as if the female is the gold standard? But if the formula is F minus M, how different is a female from a male as if the male is the gold standard? One is feminist, this one is patriarchal. Parang ganun ang konteksto nun in a political stand. Okay, so that's the difference. Okay? Now, another way of consolidating the empirical and the theoretical is to capture the ratio. Ratio naman is always empirical over theoretical. Okay? So the denominator is always the whole and the numerator is the part. So when you're talking about ratio, it's part divided by whole. Okay, which basically asks how much of the theoretical is empirical. Okay, so kumbaga, ito yung whole, this is your entire theoretical, and then this is your empirical. how much of this entire theoretical is equal to the empirical. Okay, ito yung ratio, E over T. Okay, so that is one way of looking at the ratio. On the other hand, you could also say how many times the E is to the theoretical. Okay, in other words, how many times is this compared to this? So you'll say, kung kalahati lang yan, okay, so ganito. Okay, so let's say half lang siya. Okay, so your value here is 0.5. So you're saying half of the theoretical is empirical, or the empirical is 0.5 the theoretical. Okay, so ratios. Okay, so for this reason, if we're going to use the ratio, okay, empirical divided by theoretical, okay, we have technically, okay, so the ratio here is equal to empirical divided by the theoretical. Okay, x minus mean over standard deviation. Familiar? Okay, this is how you curve your scores, right? So that ratio basically is the z-score, referred to as the standardized. Okay, so it just tells us, okay, to compute -2 divided by the standard deviation. Okay, these are how you have it. Okay, so how do you read this? We usually look at the absolute value of the z-score, so 1.41. Okay, so you're now saying that the deviation from the mean that you empirically observed is 1.41 times the theoretical or expected deviation from the mean. Ganun lang siya. Okay? Or 1.41 of the theoretical is equal to the empirical. Okay? Kaya nyo pa 3 minutes? Okay, so this is how you represent it. Okay, so let's look at the score of Mike. Okay, so the theoretical score of Mike is supposed to be 3. Okay, a mean of 3. That's the theoretical. This is the expected value. His actual score is 1. Okay, so this is the extent of variation that we actually observed from Mike. 1, 2. 2 units below the mean. Okay, so his score was actually 2 units below the mean. Anong standard deviation? We're saying a typical DLSU student, okay, would have a score below the mean, okay, that is 1.41 units. Okay, so if the score of a DLSU student is below the mean, we would theoretically expect that his score will differ from the mean by 1.41 units. Eh, yung score ni Mike differed from the mean by 2 units. So 2 divided by 1.41, okay, gives you 1.41. It means that it's 1 standard deviation plus 0.41 standard deviation. Okay, so that means this extent is 1.41 times the expected. Okay, kita nyo? So the empirical, this actual extent of deviation from the mean is 1.41 times this expected extent. Ganun lang siya. Okay, ito yung actual, ito yung theoretical. Okay, pag divide mo yan, you get 1.41, saying that this actual extent is 1.41 times this extent. What is 1.41 times 1.41? It's 2. Okay, so we'll talk more about this next meeting. Okay, so please keep review your notes para mabilis. Okay, so we're gonna talk about this next meeting, z-scores. What do they mean? How are we going to use them? And then later on, v raised to the power of 2, v raised to the power of 3, v raised to the power of 4. This will lead us to skewness and kurtosis. Okay, so magdadagdag pa tayo. This is z raised to the power of 1, then meron tayong z raised to the power of 2, then z raised to the power of 3, z raised to the power of 4, at may calculations yan for the averages. Okay. Tapos ko-combine natin itong dalawa, yung dalawang averages na yan, i-combine, you'll have normality. Okay, and then mag-introduce na tayo ng areas under the normal curve. So, nag-build up. Okay, so, yun muna. I hope you learned something today. Okay, medyo overtime na. So, see you on Thursday. Okay, please study. Yes, Gabriel?
Good afternoon, sir. Can I talk to you po after the class?
Okay.
Thank you.
Francis?
Sir, just wanted to ask lang, sir. Because in the table that you showed, your like definitions and all that, sir. Will we discuss each of them one by one, sir? Like eventually, or
What table?
like the one, sir, that you had in Word, I think was
This
it?
one?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Like the will you
This
discuss
one?
these one like eventually, sir?
No. I've been discussing it in the lessons. So all you have to do is when you review, plug in what you have captured in the lessons.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Again, the point of the exercise here is you reconstruct. You're the one who will try to figure out, okay, so that I'm not spoon feeding you. You're thinking, you're processing information. Hopefully, it's correct. Okay, so study group. Form a study group, review the recordings if available. Okay? Kasi pag in-spoon feed ko ito, i-memorize lang, hindi pinroseso yung information. So I placed this as initial, okay, so that you'll have some kind of an example, but you do the rest. You do the notes. Okay na, Francis?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
So class dismissed.
Recording.